Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. Okay, here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Pernille Bülow. Pernille, welcome.
Thank you.
So as a blue-collar daughter, Pernille defeated the odds by being a first-generation college and PhD graduate. She moved across the world to pursue neuroscience at the best research universities in the world and left little undone in her pursuit of knowledge. Because of her determination, she can now call herself an award-winning scientist. Through this scientific journey, she could also finally start her own trauma healing process. As she mastered the skills of a researcher, she realized that communication and self-insight were cornerstones of not only her professional success, but also her personal well-being. Pernille realized that her drive for research was rooted in people's mental health. She now focuses her energy on helping people thrive. Awesome. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here.
Appreciate that. So before we get going here, Pernille, please share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are now.
Okay. So I'm originally from Denmark. That's where I was born, and I lived there for 21 years. And then I moved to the US to finish my college work. And then after 10 years of moving around different places in the US for educational purposes, I ended up in Boston, and that's where I live now.
Okay, awesome. So how the heck did all this start for you? Go, share the story.
Okay. So I started in the field of psychology and then moved my way into neuroscience. And my motivation and my drive to even start asking those big questions of how do we become who we are? Why do we become the way we are? Why is it some people develop mental illnesses and some people don't? Is all inspired by having personal experiences, meeting people, living with people where you keep wondering, why are you behaving like that? And so to me, it was very much a personal development, coming of age type of pursuit of trying to understand the people around me. And in doing so, I ended up in psychology and wanting to understand, what is it that defines one person from another? Why is it that I'm so different from some of my family members, and yet I have other family members where I'm so similar to, right? So we're quickly diving into this topic of nature versus nurture, where science starts playing a role. And that's how I ended up in the field of neuroscience, because I really wanted to disentangle what is it that differentiates, one person with one mental illness from a person with another mental illness. Why is it that sometimes they're so similar, and why is it that they're sometimes so different?
Okay, so that's the foundation. Let's get specific here. What were some of those early experiences where you were like, what is going on here? What's going on with this person? What's going on with me? Share those insights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for me, it started all very, very early on in life. And I think I was probably one of those kids that always were very reflective and had a lot more questions than I had answers, which is a good thing, but sometimes also can drive you into becoming a little bit more vulnerable to mental illness, because you ask so many questions and you feel hopeless because you can't necessarily know the answers yet. And if you don't have the people around you. So for me, it was growing up in a household where there was pretty limited access to education. So as you mentioned to begin with, I'm the first one to get a college degree, and obviously the first one to get a PhD. So there was a lack of resources at the educational level. And then also growing up among parents that had mental illnesses and parents that were divorced. And the statistic now, I love looking at it from the outside now, right? Where you're seeing, well, the kids that are actually coming from divorced households and coming from households where the main caregiver has a mental illness, these kids are much more likely to develop their own mental illnesses in the future. And so that's what was happening to me. And I was dealing with a mother that was having a lot of different challenges of various sorts that now have actually meant that we're no longer in touch. And so now we're getting into the conversation of estrangement and how do you deal with that, which is also a huge conversation, right? And topic to address.
Well, okay. So how did you deal with that? How did you deal with these issues that were going on?
Yeah. So for me at the time, I can give you a whole scientific explanation of it. So please stop me if I'm using too much lingo here. But this has been one of the big passions for me in order, like diving into the psychology and neuroscience, trying to understand myself better was honestly one of the main purposes of even starting the journey. And then the passion kind of came out of that as well. So I started out being more of a pleaser. So the child that wanted constant validation and was really scared of being left behind. So you're dealing with some attachment styles here that are very strong in the abandonment sense of, fear of abandonment. And then unfortunately, when I was around 11, it kind of collapsed into a very deep depression. And in kids, the depression looks different than in adults. So for me, at the time being that age, it looked like losing my appetite, not being able to sleep appropriately, just very withdrawn, pleasing, like really just needing validation. Obviously, there are huge overlaps with adults as well, but your resources as a child are much more limited. And so one of the things that escalated and became very defining for me was that during 2 years of having a depression as a child, my appetite really decreased. And it ended up being the precursor of an eating disorder that then later on came into that really manifested as a true intense eating disorder, even though I actually already had it as a child from 9 to 11 or 11 to 13. Sorry. Yeah.
So a hell of a lot going on. I mean, really, were you able to get any kind of help at all during this time?
Yeah, no. So I was not, is the short answer. Some people were really trying. I had some great teachers that really tried to step in, especially when I think a year in, when people started noticing that I had lost some weight. Then there was more of a drive from the teacher sides to step in and have some conversations, checking in, what's going on at home, all of these really, really good things. And the challenge is, of course, that they don't really have much they can do. So they can bring a parent in and they can talk to them. But if the parent is not willing to do anything, then you have a huge barrier. And that's something I'm very, very passionate about now. I actually, just a few months ago, founded a nonprofit organization after several years of prepping. And the whole mission there is to try to address mental illness, not just among students, but also among teachers and parents, and try to break down the barriers that are holding back any of these different groups in getting the help and resources that they need. So that's really inspired by my own personal experiences at that point. Yeah.
Wow. Of course you started a nonprofit. My God, it's incredible. Okay. So how did things unfold? You moving through this process, you're not really how are you managing?
Well, I was very sick. Like I was a child crying myself to sleep most nights and, just losing weight. I was eating. I was not focusing on not eating because I wanted to be skinny. I just really did not want to eat. And I only ate when I was happy, which was limited amount of times. I think what really carried me through the day during that period of time was that I had access to horses. So animals became a huge part of my life. And I was in the barn every day. Now,
wow.
I do not come from a family that knows anything about horses or is interested in horses. In fact, now they did start supporting me later on, but they definitely encouraged me to try to figure out if I could do something else that was cheaper and easier. But the horses became a big part of my life. And I will definitely say that they played a big role in keeping me sane and keeping me motivated to keep going forward.
So what age are we talking at?
So this is the period of 11 to 13. And then I had a defining moment when I was 13 that actually kickstarted me and got me out of the depression and eating disorder pretty quickly. And that's when there was a change in my family structure where my mother divorced my stepdad at the time. And that for me looked like a moment of opportunity. Like now things are going to get better. We can start having a great life again. But unfortunately, as I was getting out of my own mental illness, my mother was diving into hers much more intensely. So she got a very intense depression. And these are things that, of course, you can see from the outside. And even though I'm 13, so now we're talking about a mini grown up at that time, you're still a child. You still very much need to be taken care of. But that was not the role that I held in that family. I was holding a role of someone who was very independent and taking care of yourself. And then now I was also dealing with a parent that had a much more intense mental illness than what she had previously.
So let's jump ahead to when you got to a point where you were like, okay, I want to start studying this. How do things unfold from there?
Yeah. So that happened. Oh man. So I'm the type of person that always have a plan. And I think that goal oriented, always having something to work towards is also something that really carried me through those very, very difficult years. I always knew I wanted to move away from Denmark. And I'm pretty sure that a big role of that was escapism. Literally, I just want to get away from here because I felt like whatever is held within the bounds of this country will always be there to haunt me. So it was important for me to get away. And so I always knew that. And then what I wanted to do varied widely. I had a long period of time where I wanted to do professional course stuff. And then I started moving more into academia. Now, granted, I did not know what it meant to go to university. I did not know what a scientist was until I was, 17, right? And so I knew what a medical doctor was, but the idea of doing science was like, I just didn't understand the concept. So these were some of the things that I learned slowly. And so it wasn't until I was 18 where I thought, I want to study psychology. Well, ideally, I wanted to study neuroscience, but you couldn't do that in Denmark. We didn't at the time have a program for that. My choices were between medicine and psychology. And then, I looked into the medicine schedule and realized I had to learn about all the bones in the urinary system. And I realized I think psychology is just more fruitful for me.
Now, was that interest in science and neuroscience and psychology, was that driven subconsciously, do you feel, by what? By
yeah.
Your
At the time when I was making those decisions, I did not do it out of an deliberate choice to try to understand myself better. And so when I started in the psychology program, again and again, we would hear from the professors there, I bet 50% of you guys are here just because you want to figure out yourself, right? And I did not identify as being part of that group. Right. And it wasn't until much later where I started realizing I keep returning to the topics that relate to myself. And there was a long period of time where I tried to force myself away from that because I thought, no, there's more to it. I don't want to be hung up on the things that I went through and just focus on that. But then I embraced it and realized, you know what, the fact that I have gone through those things makes me much more capable of studying them, of addressing them as, whichever capacity. And in terms of understanding, well, what are the types of companies that we need out there and the types of interventions that we can implement? So I tried to really understand, I got to a point where I really understood, where are my strengths in having had those experiences. And I think that's really important, right?
I want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Pernille Bülow, and I apologize for mispronouncing your name.
That's okay.
But it's a beautiful name. But all right, let's just pause here for a second to thank our sponsors. All right, we are back. Okay, so you, in terms of pursuing an education, where do you go? What do you do?
Yeah, so I started out at University of Copenhagen in their psychology program, which was one of the most like top 3 competitive programs to get into. So in Denmark, the way it works is that everything is based on grades. You're not taking any types of SAT tests or anything like that. So whatever grades you have from secondary school, 3 years, basically high school, that's all that matters. They don't care about who you are as a person, how well you can write, anything. All they care about are the grades. Thankfully, and this is because I kept falling back into my eating disorder habits, I had very, very strong perfectionism tendencies. So my perfectionism drove a straight A record.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. And which is awesome, but was coming from a very unhealthy state. And while I am someone who likes to perform and achieve, I'm also someone who actually likes to relax a little bit sometimes. But I didn't back then because I was so driven. I was so scared. Having an eating disorder it involves so much more than just not eating. There are so many thoughts. There's so many rituals that you have. You typically are comorbid with depression, anxiety, which I did have at all of these times too. So I started at University of Copenhagen, got in there, and quickly realized that program was so clinical that even at the time, I was not interested in being a therapist or in any way interacting with people that would be clients. The reason for that being was that I stereotyped people that went to therapy. I had only been to a therapist myself like 3 times at that point, right? I started seeing a therapist, but then my mother pulled me away from therapy because she thought it made me more sick. So that's a whole other story. But so I stereotyped the people that went to therapy. I kind of equated them to people like my mother, where I thought, well, I don't want to talk to people like my mother all day. I want to be a scientist. I want to understand why people become who they are. And so then I ended up transferring over to University of California, Berkeley. And I stayed there for 2 years. I finished my bachelor degree, did research while there, and then moved into my PhD in neuroscience.
Okay. Where did you do that? Just out of curiosity.
Emory University.
At Emory?
Mm-hmm.
Emory University. Awesome. So as you were going through this, what was your motivation for studying neuroscience?
Understanding why people do what they do. It was definitely, we were really talking a subconscious drive of like understanding myself and everybody around me, which was not something that really I understood until much later on. But during that period of time, I was so curious in understanding why do people become who they are? And ultimately, how can we predict how people become who they are? And that sense of wanting to predict things is now it's very much fueling me. I want to try to predict and I want to try to treat. And I want to do that in the most pragmatic way possible so that we can reach as many people as possible, as fast as possible.
So what do you do now? How are you working with people? How are you manifesting those ideas?
Yeah. So my work is really varied. I have held several hats in the past, and I currently hold several hats. Some of the roles that I currently hold are in tech, where I'm working as a research consultant, and I'm working with researchers that are doing really incredible research in mental illness. Those are the ones I specialize in, but I work very broadly and work with anybody, in particular researchers that want to implement different types of what we call biosensors to try to identify biomarkers of what qualifies a person with a particular illness and how can we also treat them. So these could be things like trying to extract your voice and figuring out what are the different features that are going on here. And I work as a research consultant privately to also advise different companies that are developing actual intervention platforms to try to create places where we can treat many people for mental illnesses.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking this sounds applicable for a lot of apps that are being created. Yeah.
Yes. One of the companies I'm working with is developing an app where it's literally trying to reach the patients and where it's a monitoring system. So you can capture people before they try to commit suicide or before they have. Yeah, it's really powerful. And I am so thrilled to be a part of that work. So that's me on the technology side. That's where I'm having my research step on. And then when I'm outside of that and I'm trying to interact with people, it comes out in a couple of different ways. One of them is that I have served for several years as a mentor for people with mental illnesses, in particular people with eating disorders. That has over the years developed into more of a life coach type of thing. I do all of this pro bono. All of my life coaching, mentoring, this is free. And that comes from wanting to make a difference, like wanting to try to help people using the skills and the insights that I have and help as many as possible. And
so how did that start for you? You started mentoring people pro bono. How did that start? That
started as I recovered. And so I did not fully recover from my eating disorder until 26, 7, something like that, 27 probably. And then I had a few years of being very, very stable weight and healthy mindset, actually starting to live my life. And that's when I felt ready to play a role in other people's lives, where I felt like, okay, I am not in denial about my own condition. I'm not trying to lie to myself or others. I'm not intentionally hiding habits that I have. So that's when I felt like I was physically and mentally ready to be there for others.
What were some of the things that helped you on your healing journey for that?
Yeah. Oh my God. I could write a book about that. So my full healing journey did not actually start until I started my PhD. The reason for that was because I had never before had really true access to healthcare. So I know we all understand Denmark as being one of the best countries in the world because it has all of these healthcare resources. Now, when it comes to therapy, there is zero. There is no support, at least back when I lived there.
Wow, so interesting.
Yeah, so you pay for everything yourself. And if you're not from a family that has the money, well, you're kind of stuck. I was lucky to have a side job where I had a private insurance. I could take some therapies lessons, like 8. But obviously, this is when I'm 19. I'm getting 8 lessons, and I have a backlog of 10 years of trauma, right? Like 8 sessions are not going to be enough. We all know that as therapists and coaches and whatever profession you have out there, you probably know 8 sessions is never going to be enough. You need right. So when I started my PhD, I was lucky to have a really solid insurance, and I started seeing a therapist, and I started seeing a nutritionist. And as I really started diving into my problems, I also started seeing a psychiatrist, and I started seeing a cognitive sleep therapist. The reason for that was because I have struggled with insomnia, which was anxiety induced. And so I'm having like 5 doctors and therapists that I'm seeing at one point, on a regular basis. So that was absolutely a foundation that was necessary. Now, on top of having all of these fantastic, all of them women, just like all these incredible women that were supporting me, I also started riding horses again, which I had put on the shelf for a while. And I started building a community. I built a community among the horse people, and I built a community among my fellow students.
Where was this now?
At Emory University, so during my PhD.
Okay.
And building that community, having the horses coming back into the picture was a very big addition to my recovery journey. Wow. And then when I started having a stable weight, like what was really left? And I think I'm very in touch with the eating disorder field, both in terms of talking to clinicians on a regular basis, as well as patients. And one of the things I hear again and again, and that I personally experienced, is the body dysmorphia. The body dysmorphia hangs on to you. It is, you might be healthy and you're eating right, but you still just think your body does not look okay. And that is so difficult to live with. That did not recover for me until I was around 27 or so. And what really helped me get through that was doing art therapy and doing more mindfulness and meditation and starting to exercise in a more healthy and mindful way. And so I would absolutely recommend everybody to do that. Journaling obviously is great too. Getting the emotions out of the body instead of holding on to them was important for me.
Can you talk just a little bit about the body dysmorphia? When did that start for you? When did you realize that was going on for you?
Yeah, so this is back. So now we're going back in time again.
Yeah.
So this was when I was around 16. This is when I fell back into my first real, very serious bout of anorexia. And I got very, very skinny. It was very unhealthy, and it all was spurred. I mean, it's always spurred by a bunch of different factors, right? So I had a lot of backlog of trauma. Then I had a surgery that just basically meant that I couldn't eat properly for a bit of time. And that kind of fueled this motivation for, oh, maybe I never have to eat, And then I started having much more, again, I had a rise in problems in the home life, in the family life. And so the body dysmorphia kicked in and was really a maintenance factor. I recovered from my first bout of the anorexia when I was 18, 19, probably. And then I fell back into it when I was 20. And you just saw these periods that in like cyclically. And that is so common among people with anorexia. I mean, over 50% of the people that recover will relapse. It's just the statistics are staggering. Only 20% will recover without a relapse. These are based on the statistics we have. A lot of this goes unreported, so we don't actually know the true statistics, right? Yeah.
So you're providing a lot of pro bono work for people who have experiencing issues with eating and anorexia, and is your day job as a neuroscientist, is that where you're supporting yourself?
Yeah. That. And then I do a lot of writing. So I am a writer at Psychology Today. I write for different types of magazines. So I also get some side money from that, and I have some side gigs. I'm very active. Whenever I say it out loud, I always realize, holy moly, like I'm doing a lot of things. And on top of that, I have a ton of hobbies. So I do think for me, I was not a happy person for most of my life, which hopefully has come across by now, but I am a very happy person now. And that was something that fundamentally changed. Like as I recovered from my eating disorder, my mindset totally changed. It was like, I was ready to grab life by the horns and have fun, because I didn't have a proper childhood where I actually had fun. I didn't have a proper teenage time where I actually had fun. My 20s sucked, like my early 20s at least sucked. So now I'm there, late 20s. I'm like, holy moly, like I have missed out on so many things. I barely have any good memories to report. And I know that sounds a bit dramatic, and I'm sure there are people that will disagree with me, but from a subjective perspective of what I would record as the happiest moments in my life, they would all be the recent years where I have collected those moments of happiness. And if there's anybody sitting out there having an eating disorder, or in any sense, dealing with something like this, I would really just like to let you know that you will get better, and it will be so much better on the other side. And you will have so much fun. You'll be laughing so much. You won't even care about your body at that point. It's crazy. It's as if it's a different world to live in, which is very powerful.
You've mentioned a lot of instances where it sounds like you were debilitated by a lot of the things you were going through. And what were some of those things that got you over the edge, that brought the sunlight of hope into those moments?
Yeah.
Was it someone? Was it a horse? What was it?
Yeah, that I don't know if I can narrow it down like that. I think going back to a point I mentioned earlier about always being super goal oriented, I always had something I was working towards. And actually, it was one of the last things I had to deal with in terms of I had to stop doing that because I was constantly working towards something. And that's not always healthy. Sometimes you need to just take a chill and not work so much, right? But I actually think that obsession with constantly having a goal was what gave me something to live for. I was very suicidal as a child from 11 to 13. If you go back into my diary, you will see how I'm contemplating suicide many, many times, making plans about how to do it.
Oh. Did you ever try?
No. Yeah, thankfully.
So when you work with people who are going through, who are experiencing having eating disorders, what's your perspective? Obviously, people are different. Every case is different. But how do you approach that with someone?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if there are therapists out there, I know there are therapists out there and they might disagree with me, and that's totally cool. I understand my role whenever I talk to people with eating disorders or any other types of particular types of mental illnesses is to try to figure out what is it they want to live for. What are they maybe already living for? And trying to help them nourish that and try to give them back that energy for life. Wanting to get, what about some hobbies? What are some hobbies you dropped and that you would like to take up? Or what are some hobbies that, you have never done, but you're super curious about? What are some friends that you haven't reconnected with for a long time? So it's basically giving them the support system. I had one person, she's now a friend of mine, where she was a, well-educated woman, very accomplished in many ways, but stuck at home with her parents in a job that didn't pay enough to make her live independently. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing there was, well, here is a huge barrier, which is that you're not happy where you're living. This is a structural factor that we can fix. You're not happy with your job. You're not happy with where you live. So I sat down and helped her with her resume, her cover letters, identifying jobs, practicing interviews. Lo and behold, she gets a job. She can move away from her parents. She can start living a more independent life. And sure, there's still going to be a lot of issues. She still needs to see a therapist that can keep in touch with her. I kept in touch with her, kept talking about these things. But what has happened in this period of time is that, one, we have broken down some of the structural barriers that have kept her in her eating disorder. And two, we've given her a level of confidence and independence that is very, very difficult to achieve for people with mental illnesses because they feel incapacitated many times. So we have broken down some of the habits that she has built up where she's telling herself, oh, I can't do that. Oh, no, it's better. Why should I even try to do this other thing? Right? We've given her the confidence and the hope of living life differently. And so that's really where I'm at. I'm trying to focus on how can we make you like life again? And what is it that makes you, when you wake up in the morning, like what is it that makes you smile? Let's make sure you have a lot of that. And I really do, regardless of, like, you should always, there's a lot of great therapies out there, keep doing them. But I really think that these fundamental things in terms of like how you live your life day to day are foundational for your mental health.
As we kind of get down towards the end here and closing out, as you've talked and shared about your life, Pernille, there's an obvious seeming contradiction, dichotomy, right? In your life. I mean, you've had this traumatic, very difficult, challenging childhood with not a lot of happy memories. And yet you, in a way, you can contrast that with a lot of amazing success. And how do you square that in a sense? Has one driven the other?
No, I think that's a great question and a little bit of this, a difficult question to answer and something that you should be very serious about, actually, because you don't want to think that suddenly it's a good thing to have mental illnesses because it's going to make you a super person, right? I think I learned a lot from everything. I learned a lot from all of the mental illnesses that I had to navigate during my time and the different types of people I had to navigate. Who knows? I probably would not have ended up in this place where I'm at now if it wasn't because of all of that. but chances are very high that I would have ended up in a different type of very happy situation. And so while I am very happy with where I'm at currently, I also think I would have been equally, if not more happy, if I had grown up in a happy childhood, right? And now we're starting to talk about things like resilience and susceptibility. And I'm probably one of the children that came out slightly more resilient than the average, which meant that I kept going and didn't give up. And, and that has carried me through. But I don't think we should ever look at mental illness as something that will inherently make a person better. But it's something that has shaped me and made me very, very, very passionate about advocating for others and advocating for systemic change and structural change.
Awesome. What's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
I have a website. It is my name. I'll spell it out loud. PernilleBulow.com. And you can contact me there. There's a little contact me thing. You can also read about what I do, get the links to everything that I have just mentioned and bombarded you with. Yeah.
Awesome. It was a pleasure having you on here. So inspiring. Oh my God, I'd love to have you back at a later date.
Absolutely. Yes.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.